links with any cigarette manufacturers in my research into safety and effects of electronic cigarettes funded by these public bodies. I'll be talking about the role of nicotine in anti-e-cigarette sentiment. I think even the hardcore anti-EC activists, e-cigarette, I'll just call them EC, agree that smoking kills and that vaping is much safer, and yet they want vaping banned or suppressed. And this is a bit of a mystery. And they clearly believe that stopping smokers from switching, although it's bad for smokers, it's a price worth paying. And I'll give you some thoughts on why I think they think that. But before, and the little graph I put there is what other people have shown you, that the population perception of e-cigarettes is going the wrong way, that clearly the public is being misinformed. I have to say that apart from media and Daily Mail and so on, who are very keen, of course, to have something alarming, there's a big audience and a big thirst for negative news about e-cigarettes. And there are different audiences. And in here, most people are in favor of e-cigarettes. In most other conferences, most people are against e-cigarettes. And people play to different galleries. And the sort of eagerness to say something negative about e-cigarettes is very warmly received by medical press and various organizations. And that is another source of this type of sort of negative slant on things. But these are my very tentative and potentially totally wrong observations about the anti-cigarette sentiment. So why do people think that smokers should be stopped from switching to e-cigarettes when they admit that it's not just probably, but with definite certainty much, much safer? I believe that a lot of people see the main goals of tobacco control to eradicate tobacco industry and to eradicate nicotine use. They also see the role in preventing smoke-related disease and death and disability, but it's less important than the first two goals. They usually have no involvement with smoking cessation or relevant research, of course with some exceptions. And they believe that if electronic cigarettes didn't come on the scene, over time, the approaches we have now, which are lowering smoking prevalence, and there's less and less people smoking, less and less people being lured into smoking, eventually smoking will disappear, tobacco industry will disappear, and of course then death and disease will disappear as well. So if we just carry on, it may take some decades, it may take 60, 70, 100 years, but you will achieve all three goals. And now with electronic cigarettes coming back, it may help smokers avoid premature death and disease, but it undermines the other two goals. It allows nicotine still to be used, and it allows tobacco industry or other people still to profit from people getting addicted to nicotine. And I think that is my reading of it. I leave out the discussion about the fight with tobacco industry. Just one possible comment on this. If you fight tobacco industry and think this is so important, it's more important than prevent death and disease in smokers, and within your fight, you actually now slowing down people moving away from cigarettes, you're doing something similar to what tobacco industry does. But let me focus on this nicotine issue. What are the concerns about nicotine? I'll leave out the potential health risks of nicotine. There are some, but not major ones. And let's just assume that we're talking about a source of nicotine which is totally devoid of health risks. And there would, of course, still be these issues. It's poisonous, addictive, and does something to adolescent brain. And I'm not saying these are stupid points. All of them, actually, there is something in them, but not as much as people make out. Regarding the toxicity of nicotine and e-liquid, and you all know this, and probably other people presented on that, the common claim that this is an extremely poisonous substance is just wrong. Nobody knew where it came from. I tried with Neil Benowitz at one stage to trace it back, and we just lost patience because every textbook cites the previous textbook. Finally, a colleague from Austria did this work and traced it back to 19th century made-up figure. The suicide attempts have been recorded with up to 1,500 milligrams, and people just vomit and are fine. Very tough to kill yourself with nicotine. There is one completed suicide, I think, with 15,000 milligrams, plus some other drugs. It doesn't mean that it's not poisonous, and it should be in child-proof packaging, and one has to be cautious. But for instance, this new European ruling about having tiny little capsules of it, because otherwise it will poison the whole family, and the dog is just not justified. So that's the consensus about the toxicity. There's a consensus about addictiveness. And now this is fairly important. I think somebody here at the audience in the previous discussion was talking about how addictive nicotine is. Cigarettes are very addictive. I'm just looking at some data which suggests that actually over 60% of people who try smoking end up being daily smokers. And of course, more than half of them later quits. But you try one cigarette, over 60% chance you'll become a daily smoker. That's how attractive that thing is and how soon you get into the habit of using it daily. But that's true for cigarettes. That's not true for nicotine. Nicotine alone, with animal experiments, it's not easy to get them to self-administer nicotine, unlike the other addictive drugs. And they would always prefer anything with some sweet taste to it to nicotine. It's not a big reinforcer at all. And if you look at nicotine in nicotine replacement treatments, we don't know of any non-smokers who would suddenly become nicotine users using nicotine replacement treatments. And we have a very similar situation with e-cigarettes. Never smokers are not becoming daily vapors. And you may hear me saying that and say, yeah, but what about all this research showing the huge upsurge in youth vaping? Like Charlotte was showing one of those. And is there some huge big thing going on? And there isn't. Electronic cigarettes use spreads. More non-smokers try vaping, but they don't progress to daily use. But it gets misreported as if it does. And this is how the trick is done. And this is primarily from American studies. The surveys typically ask, did you ever use an e-cigarette? And if you did, you get classified as a user. And then there's a question, have you used electronic cigarettes on at least one of the past 30 days? Or another variation of it, in the past 30 days, did you use an e-cigarette? And if you did, you're a current user. Now, that terminology, of course, is terribly misleading, clearly misleading. If you have somebody who once tried alcohol, hated it, and swore never to try it again, that person would be classified as drinker. And if they tried it in the past 30 days, they would be classified as current drinker. If you ask about, is that a smoker, what you mean is that a daily smoker, let alone current smoker? It must be a daily smoker. It's totally misleading. And then you have the reports of youth are using or currently using, implying that they are daily users. This question, of course, should be asked, as most UK surveys do. Do you use them daily, weekly, monthly, less than monthly? And you've already seen, I think Deborah was showing some of these data that we actually see very few non-smokers who would use e-cigarettes. They must exist some out there. But it's also possible that those tiny little fraction of a percentage of non-smokers who say I use them regularly or even daily could be just a misreport or some error in data, or if it exists, it's just minimal. And you compare this with 60% of smokers who will become daily smokers. So I'd say up to now, the dependence potential of e-cigarettes is virtually zero. I'm not saying that it's going to stay that way. I think as the e-cigarettes improve and tick more boxes for smokers, they may develop the dependence potential more. But at the time being, non-smokers do not get hooked on nicotine through e-cigarettes. And the last concern is this nicotine in adolescent brain, and you hear it increasingly often. And initially it's coming from animal studies where indeed if you start to dose animals, that usually in those studies 1-week-old animals would get very high dose of nicotine and can disrupt their behavior and do things to them. And I'm not sure if this is relevant to human smokers. But there is some evidence, or possibly good evidence, that the earlier initiation of smoking is linked to heavier smoking, less quitting. Now, it could be self-selection. The causality is not 100% clear, but you could make a good theoretical case for early start of nicotine dosing leading to need for more of this and longer-term dependence. And we certainly would agree with e-cigarette critics that you should avoid giving nicotine to young people, and certainly there should be limits to sales and so on. And there is no question about that. We also need to consider whether if a young person would try one or the other actually has access to electronic cigarettes, whether it actually has some protective effect. And you've already seen this slide. Of course, one can't deduce from it that the drop in, is there the wrong button. This drop in smoking prevalence is caused by this increase in e-cigarette experimentation. I wouldn't go as far as that, but what it shows very clearly that the increase in e-cigarette experimentation is not leading to increase in smoking. There are some other concerns which are not major, but maybe worth addressing, and this is one about dual users. Most smokers who eventually stop smoking with e-cigarettes, of course, go through a period when they use both, and that's why on all these surveys you see the majority of people who use e-cigarettes are also smoking. There is no chance that this will lead to any cumulative danger. We know from studies of nicotine replacement that if you give people nicotine replacement while they're smoking, they would reduce their smoking. The same with varenicline, and of course, it will be the same with e-cigarettes. And here's just some data from a study we published recently, 40 smokers who want to quit. We took measures at baseline. They were given cigar-like electronic cigarettes, a fairly strong one, followed up at 4 weeks, and we repeated the tests. Some dropped out, and about half stopped smoking, and the half were dual users. Those who stopped smoking, as you would expect, this is a percentage change, so they reduced their carbon monoxide and acrolein levels to non-smoking levels. Their cotinine dropped a little bit, but not significantly. So they maintained nicotine, removed toxins. And these are the dual users. They also reduced carbon monoxide and acrolein. This is sort of somewhat surprising, but the cotinine level is not significantly reduced, but there is a significant decrease in the intake of toxins, as you would expect. So I think the dual users out there, I don't think there's any chance that they are now getting more nicotine than they used to and more toxins than they're used to. They're getting possibly the same amount of nicotine, and definitely they are reducing their toxin intake. The other issue is the passive vaping, and as we discussed here several times, there's actually no exposure to carbonyls or phenols or volatile compound. The particulates are much, much lower than from smoking. And regarding nicotine, there is some delivered on surfaces, but a baby would need to lick 30 square meters of floor to get 1 milligram of nicotine. So exposure to nicotine from passive vaping is non-existent. I believe I only have 2 minutes left, so I skipped. I wanted to show you some new interesting data on nicotine delivery. Just in a nutshell, people are now getting nicotine from e-cigarettes much more efficient than they used to. It still doesn't match cigarettes so far. Now, the renormalization of smoking is, to my mind, clearly a bogus concern. There is no risk at all, theoretically, or any hint of it, that increase in use of e-cigarettes will somehow increase use of normal cigarettes. E-cigarettes are replacing cigarettes. They're not increasing their sales. And if I had more time, I would explain to you why this is a total nonsense. But there is an issue about renormalization of nicotine use. And I think that should be discussed openly. Rather than people coming up with these bogus concerns, they would say, we're concerned about nicotine use staying in the population. And there will be some disadvantages to this. It's not terribly healthy to be hooked on nicotine, but it should be discussed openly. What's going to happen with nicotine use is unclear. This is the UK data from Robert, showing that as more people use e-cigarettes, they use less cigarettes, but overall nicotine is actually declining rather than going up. This is what happened with snus, and I would love to have data up to now. I think it's plateauing now, I had. But what you see here again, that the overall nicotine use is not going up. People who wouldn't otherwise smoke, in Sweden they are now using snus. And it's quite likely that say in the UK, people who would otherwise smoke will vape, and that's going to be the swap. I wanted to go through this cautionary tale about snus use, where it reduced smoking in Sweden. It cut out respiratory cancers very dramatically, and it just means that the ban of snus was a serious public health mistake, and it was done on the same precautionary principles and twisted evidence and false alarms as is happening now with e-cigarettes. And I think people responsible for that ban, not for the original ban, then nobody knew. But those who renewed the ban now should really be held accountable for what they are actually causing. And it's the same group, of course, who imposed the damaging regulation. So in summary, the one part of the consensus of anti-cigarette activists is the use of nicotine, which has been declining, and now electronic cigarettes may bring it back. I think it should be discussed honestly without misleading smokers and regulators with bogus concerns and misinterpretation of evidence. And I think the snus story shows how ideology can damage public health. So I'll finish there.
We've got time for a question because Peter's not actually on this panel. So again, clearly show your hands. Any questions for Peter? Is it all crystal clear? Oh, no. David.
David Abrams from Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I'm intrigued with this larger idea of rethinking nicotine and what it means to society when you decouple it from the deadly inhalation and highest addiction of tobacco smoke. I think your points are good ones. I'm interested in the issue of addiction, and if it's less addictive in other forms of delivery, or even if it's as addictive, is it fair to equate the medical disease of addiction of nicotine as almost as if it's equally damaging to public health as the inseparable inhalation of that same nicotine in the toxic smoke? Or should we really be rethinking how we think of nicotine, even the issue of severity of addiction, as not nearly at the same scale as when it's inhaled and inseparable from smoke?
Well, yeah, my answer would be yes, of course, yes. And there would be some downsides. There are some downsides of coffee drinking. Some people do need several cups of coffee a day. They spend more money on it than is wise. They spend time on it, but it's not a major public health issue. And I guess nicotine use would be close to that. Not totally. I think nicotine use will have some other adverse effects more than caffeine has, but it won't be far from that. And I think people have a difficulty divorcing nicotine from smoking, as you say.